The station buzzed with the usual evening activity as the Midnight Express prepared for its journey. It was a beloved train, known for its vintage charm and storied past. The locomotive itself was a grand old machine, its exterior polished to a gleaming finish, and its interiors reminiscent of a bygone era, with plush seats and wood-paneled walls. The conductor, Mr. Grayson, was a friendly figure in his crisp uniform, greeting passengers with a smile and a tip of his hat. Families, couples, and lone travelers boarded the train, their chatter filling the air. Among them was Emily, a young woman traveling to visit her sick grandmother in a distant town. She carried a small suitcase and wore a worried expression. Seated nearby was Mr. Thompson, a businessman with a stern face, glancing at his pocket watch every few minutes. Across from him sat Mrs. Cartwright, an elderly lady with a knitting bag, humming softly to herself. As the train's departure time approached, a sense of anticipation mingled with the crisp autumn air. The platform lights flickered, casting long shadows, and the full moon rose high above, illuminating the forest that bordered the tracks. The whistle blew, a long, mournful sound that seemed to echo into the depths of the night. With a lurch, the train began to move, the wheels clattering rhythmically against the tracks. Emily settled into her seat by the window, watching the city lights fade into the distance. The train picked up speed, the forest closing in around them, trees blurring into a dark green mass. She glanced at the other passengers, noticing the varied expressions, some excited, some weary, some lost in thought. Little did they know this journey would not go as planned. Mr. Grayson made his way through the carriages, checking tickets and engaging in light conversation. There was something reassuring about his presence, a steady constant in the face of the unknown journey ahead. The train rolled smoothly along, and as the hours passed, passengers began to doze off, lulled by the gentle rocking and the distant hum of the engine. Outside, the forest thickened, and the path ahead seemed to grow darker. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine, though she couldn't pinpoint why. She shook off the feeling, attributing it to fatigue. As she closed her eyes, she couldn't help but wonder what the next few hours would bring. The Midnight Express pressed on, deeper into the night, carrying its passengers away from the safety of the familiar and into the heart of an ancient forest. The journey that had started with such promise was about to take a turn no one could have predicted, marking the beginning of a tale that would be whispered in hushed tones for years to come. The Midnight Express glided deeper into the forest, its rhythmic clatter a steady backdrop to the night. The initial excitement of departure had faded, replaced by a quiet calm that settled over the passengers. The moon's light filtered through the dense canopy, casting a patchwork of shadows that danced eerily along the train's interior. Emily shifted in her seat, her gaze fixed on the window. The dark forest outside seemed to press in on the train, a never-ending expanse of twisted branches and dense underbrush. She tried to focus on the faint reflections of her fellow passengers, but the darkness outside seemed to pull her attention back, compelling her to look deeper into the void. Mr. Thompson, the businessman, put away his pocket watch and adjusted his glasses, frowning slightly. The steady rhythm of the train was usually soothing, but tonight, something felt off. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced around the carriage, noting the unease that had subtly crept over the passengers. Mrs. Cartwright, with her knitting needles clicking softly, paused and looked up, her humming faltering. She glanced towards the window, her eyes narrowing as if she saw something in the forest that no one else could. Shaking her head, she resumed her knitting, but her hands trembled slightly. The lights inside the train flickered momentarily, eliciting gasps and uneasy murmurs. Mr. Grayson, ever the steady conductor, moved through the carriage, offering reassurances. "Just a minor electrical issue, folks, nothing to worry about," he said with a practiced smile, though his eyes betrayed a hint of concern. Emily wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, the chill in the air growing more pronounced. It was unusual, she thought, for the temperature to drop so quickly inside the train. She noticed other passengers doing the same, rubbing their arms and shifting uncomfortably. The train plunged further into the forest, and the trees outside seemed to grow denser, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. The moonlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy, casting the train in an ever-deepening gloom. Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being enveloped, as if the forest was closing in around them. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the train, causing everyone to jump. Mr. Grayson hurried to the source of the noise, finding nothing out of the ordinary. "Probably just an animal on the tracks," he reassured, though his voice lacked conviction. As the hours dragged on, an oppressive silence fell over the train. The usual sounds of conversation and laughter had dwindled, replaced by anxious whispers and the occasional nervous cough. The once cozy and nostalgic atmosphere of the Midnight Express now felt foreboding and claustrophobic. Emily glanced at the other passengers, seeing her own unease mirrored in their faces. There was something unsettling about the forest outside, something ancient and watchful. She couldn't help but feel that they had crossed an invisible boundary, entering a realm where they did not belong. The Midnight Express continued its relentless journey into the unknown, the forest growing ever darker and more menacing. The passengers, gripped by a collective sense of dread, could only sit and wait, their fear mounting with each passing mile. The Midnight Express raced through the inky darkness of the forest, the rhythmic clatter of its wheels a constant companion to the passengers' growing unease. Emily's eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but she couldn't bring herself to sleep. Every creak of the train, every rustle from the forest set her nerves on edge. Suddenly, with a jarring screech, the train lurched violently, throwing passengers from their seats. Emily gripped the armrest, her heart pounding. The lights flickered wildly before plunging the carriages into complete darkness. Panic spread like wildfire as people cried out, disoriented and terrified. "What happened?" a voice shouted from the rear of the carriage. Mr. Grayson, his calm demeanor strained, quickly moved down the aisle, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating pale, frightened faces. "Please remain calm," Mr. Grayson called out, though his voice wavered slightly. "We've made an unscheduled stop, but there's no need to panic. I'll get to the bottom of this." The passengers murmured among themselves, fear thick in the air. Emily clutched her shawl tighter, her eyes wide. Mr. Thompson checked his watch again, though it offered no comfort now. Mrs. Cartwright crossed herself, whispering prayers under her breath. Mr. Grayson made his way to the front of the train, where the engineer and a few crew members were already examining the controls. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice urgent. The engineer, a grizzled man named Hank, shook his head in frustration. "I don't know. Everything was fine, and then we just stopped. It's like the brakes engaged on their own." "Can we get moving again?" Mr. Grayson asked, his eyes scanning the dark forest outside the window. The trees seemed to press closer, their branches like grasping fingers. Hank sighed, wiping sweat from his brow. "I'm working on it, but this isn't like anything I've seen before. It's as if something doesn't want us to move." Mr. Grayson's flashlight beam flickered, and he felt a chill run down his spine. "Keep trying," he said, turning to reassure the passengers once more. Back in the carriages, anxiety grew as the minutes ticked by. Emily exchanged worried glances with Mr. Thompson and Mrs. Cartwright. "What could have caused this?" Emily whispered. Mr. Thompson shook his head, his face grim. "I don't know, but we need to stay calm and wait for the crew to figure it out." Outside, the forest was unnaturally still. No wind rustled the leaves, no animals called in the night. It was as if the world held its breath, waiting. Mr. Grayson returned, his expression strained but composed. "Folks, it appears we've encountered some technical difficulties. We're working to resolve the issue. In the meantime, please stay seated and try to remain calm." Hours passed, and the tension in the air grew thicker. The train remained stubbornly immobile, a silent sentinel in the heart of the forest. Mr. Grayson and the crew worked tirelessly, but nothing seemed to help. The controls were unresponsive, and the train refused to budge. As dawn approached, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They were stranded, alone in an impenetrable forest with no means of communication, and no idea when, or if, they would be able to leave. Emily peered out the window, the first light of day revealing the dense, unwelcoming forest. A sense of foreboding washed over her. Whatever had stopped the train, it felt like it was only the beginning of their ordeal. The Midnight Express had halted in the middle of nowhere, and its passengers were left to face an uncertain, terrifying future. The first rays of dawn struggled to penetrate the dense canopy of the forest, casting the train in a murky twilight. Inside the Midnight Express, a heavy silence had settled over the passengers. The initial shock of the sudden halt had given way to a creeping dread. Every creak of the carriage and every rustle of leaves outside felt ominous, amplifying their sense of isolation. Emily sat hunched in her seat, her eyes red from lack of sleep. She gazed out the window, hoping for any sign of civilization, but the view remained unchanged. An endless expanse of trees, their gnarled branches entwined like skeletal fingers. She could feel the unease of her fellow passengers, a collective anxiety that seemed to thicken the very air they breathed. Mr. Thompson, normally a pillar of composure, fidgeted with his pocket watch, its steady ticking a stark contrast to the unsettling stillness outside. "This silence," he muttered to no one in particular. "It's not natural. Not a single bird, not a rustle, nothing." Mrs. Cartwright, who had been knitting to keep her hands busy, paused and looked up. "It's as if the forest is holding its breath," she said quietly, her voice trembling. She clutched her rosary tighter, her fingers moving over the beads in a silent prayer. Mr. Grayson and the remaining crew had not given up their efforts to restart the train. The conductor's usually crisp uniform was now rumpled, and dark circles had formed under his eyes. He conferred with Hank and the other engineers, their faces etched with frustration and fear. "Anything?" Mr. Grayson asked, though he knew the answer. Hank shook his head, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. "I've checked everything twice. There's no mechanical reason for the train to have stopped. It's like something beyond our understanding is at work here." Mr. Grayson nodded grimly. "Keep trying. We can't stay here." Back in the carriages, the passengers' fear was becoming palpable. A young boy, no more than 6, clung to his mother's arm, his eyes wide with confusion. "Mama, when can we go home?" he asked, his voice a thin whisper. "Soon, darling," his mother replied, though her eyes betrayed her uncertainty. She hugged him close, trying to offer comfort she did not feel. As the hours dragged on, hunger and thirst began to gnaw at the passengers. The dining car, once a place of comfort and camaraderie, was now a scene of quiet desperation. People picked at the remaining food, their movements slow and lethargic. Emily approached Mr. Grayson as he made his rounds, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are we going to do? We can't stay here forever." Mr. Grayson sighed, rubbing his temples. "We're doing everything we can to get the train moving again. In the meantime, we need to conserve our resources and stay calm. Panic will only make things worse." But staying calm was easier said than done. As night began to fall again, the oppressive silence deepened. The forest outside seemed to grow darker, the shadows lengthening and merging into an impenetrable blackness. The train felt like a fragile bubble of light and life in an ocean of darkness. Then, faintly at first but growing louder, the passengers began to hear it. Whispers. They seemed to come from the very walls of the train, soft and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. Emily's heart raced as she strained to make out the words, but they remained elusive, just beyond comprehension. "Do you hear that?" Mr. Thompson asked, his voice edged with panic. "What is that sound?" Mrs. Cartwright crossed herself again, her knitting forgotten. "It's the forest," she whispered. "It's speaking to us." The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they filled the carriages with an almost unbearable sense of dread. Emily covered her ears, but it did little to block out the sound. She looked around at the other passengers, seeing her own terror reflected in their faces. The Midnight Express was no longer just a stranded train. It had become a prison of fear and uncertainty. As the whispers continued, the passengers could only huddle together, hoping for some kind of reprieve from the suffocating silence and the inexplicable horrors that seemed to surround them. Night fell once more over the Midnight Express, casting the train in an oppressive darkness. The whispers that had filled the carriages grew quieter, but no less disturbing, as if retreating to the shadows to observe their victims. Fear and exhaustion etched deep lines into the passengers' faces, and a palpable sense of dread hung in the air. Mr. Grayson gathered the crew in the dining car for a hushed meeting. Hank, the engineer, leaned against the counter, his face pale and drawn. Beside him stood the two remaining crew members, Sarah and Mike, their expressions mirroring his unease. "We can't stay here much longer," Mr. Grayson began, his voice low but firm. "We've tried everything to get the train moving, and nothing's worked. We need to find help." Hank nodded, though he looked skeptical. "But how? We're in the middle of nowhere, and the forest is unnatural. There's something out there." Sarah shivered, glancing nervously at the windows. "We can't just wait here. We have to do something." Mr. Grayson took a deep breath. "Hank, Mike, and I will venture into the forest. We'll look for a way out, a road, a house, anything. Sarah, you stay here and keep the passengers calm. We'll leave at first light." The decision made, the crew dispersed. Mr. Grayson spent the night restlessly, his mind racing with possibilities and fears. When the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, casting a pale glow over the train, he roused Hank and Mike. The passengers watched in anxious silence as the three men prepared to leave. Emily felt a pang of fear for them and a sense of foreboding she couldn't shake. "Be careful," she whispered as Mr. Grayson passed by. He gave her a tight smile. "We'll be back soon." Armed with flashlights, a map, and a compass, the three men stepped off the train and into the dense forest. The oppressive silence of the previous night seemed to have lifted slightly, replaced by an uneasy stillness. The forest felt alive, but not in a way that was comforting. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves, seemed to hide unseen eyes. Back on the train, the hours dragged by with excruciating slowness. Sarah did her best to keep the passengers calm, distributing what little food and water they had left, and offering reassurances she didn't believe. Emily sat by the window, her eyes scanning the forest for any sign of the crew's return. As evening approached, the sense of dread among the passengers intensified. Mr. Thompson paced the aisle, muttering to himself. Mrs. Cartwright clutched her rosary, her lips moving in silent prayer. The young boy and his mother huddled together, their fear palpable. Darkness fell, and the forest swallowed the last light of day. Still, there was no sign of Mr. Grayson, Hank, or Mike. The passengers grew increasingly agitated, their whispers turning to nervous chatter. "They should have been back by now," Mr. Thompson said, his voice tinged with panic. "Something's happened to them." Sarah did her best to remain calm. "We have to give them more time. The forest is dense. It could have taken longer than expected, but deep down she feared the worst. The train felt more like a tomb with each passing hour. The oppressive silence returned, heavier than before, pressing down on their spirits. At midnight, the whispers began again, soft and insistent. Emily tried to block them out, but they seemed to seep into her mind, filling her with an almost paralyzing fear. She glanced at the other passengers, seeing the same terror reflected in their eyes. Then, as if to confirm their worst fears, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the forest. It was distant but unmistakable, a sound of pure terror. The passengers froze, their eyes wide with horror. Emily felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "That was Mr. Grayson," she whispered, her voice trembling. Sarah stood up, her face pale. "We need to stay together. Lock the doors, close the windows. Whatever's out there, we need to keep it out." The passengers scrambled to comply, their fear lending them a desperate energy. They locked the doors and drew the curtains, huddling together in the center of the carriage. The whispers grew louder, filling the enclosed space with their eerie cadence. The Midnight Express, now a fortress of terrified souls, stood silent and motionless in the heart of the forest. As the night wore on, the realization set in that the crew was not coming back. The passengers were alone, trapped in an inexplicable nightmare with no end in sight. The train had become a vessel of despair, and the forest outside seemed to revel in their fear. As dawn approached once more, the passengers could only pray for a miracle to deliver them from the unseen horrors that surrounded them. The first light of dawn barely penetrated the dense forest, casting long shadows across the carriages of the Midnight Express. The train, once a symbol of nostalgia and comfort, now felt like a prison. The disappearance of Mr. Grayson, Hank, and Mike weighed heavily on the passengers, their fear festering into a suffocating dread. Sarah, the remaining crew member, tried to maintain order. She moved through the carriages, offering forced smiles and empty reassurances, but her own fear was palpable. The passengers huddled in small groups, their conversations hushed and filled with anxiety. Emily sat by the window, her eyes red from lack of sleep and constant vigilance. The forest outside seemed to close in on the train, the trees standing like silent sentinels. The whispers had faded with dawn, but the oppressive silence was almost worse. She couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching them, waiting for something. Mrs. Cartwright, her knitting abandoned, sat with her rosary in hand, mumbling prayers under her breath. Mr. Thompson paced the aisle, his nerves frayed. "We can't just sit here," he said, voicing what everyone was thinking. "We need to do something." Sarah paused, looking around at the frightened faces. "I know, but we can't leave the train. The forest, it's not safe. We have to wait for help." "But what if help never comes?" Mr. Thompson's voice rose in desperation. "We could starve here, or worse." A murmur of agreement spread through the carriage. Emily stood up, drawing everyone's attention. "We need to signal for help. Maybe we can start a fire or use the train's horn." Sarah nodded, latching onto the idea. "Yes, we can try using the horn at regular intervals. And if we gather some wood, we could start a signal fire, but we have to be careful. We don't know what's out there." The passengers, desperate for action, quickly organized. Mr. Thompson and a few others gathered what they could find to burn, while Sarah and Emily made their way to the front of the train to try the horn. Sarah sat in the engineer's seat and pressed the horn. The loud blast shattered the stillness, echoing through the forest. They waited, but there was no response. "We'll try again every hour," Sarah said, her voice determined. "Let's get back and see if the others have managed to start the fire." They returned to find a small pile of wood and other flammable materials assembled near the train. Mr. Thompson struck a match and lit the pile, the flames quickly catching and sending smoke spiraling into the sky. The passengers watched the fire with a mix of hope and apprehension, their eyes flickering between the flames and the encroaching forest. Night fell once more, bringing with it the oppressive darkness and the return of the whispers. The passengers gathered around the fire, its warmth and light offering a small measure of comfort, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling their minds with a creeping terror. Emily clutched her shawl tightly, her eyes darting to the shadows beyond the firelight. "We can't stay out here," she whispered. "We need to get back on the train." Reluctantly, the passengers retreated to the carriages, locking the doors and closing the curtains. The whispers seemed to follow them, seeping through the walls and filling the air with an almost tangible malice. Sarah and Emily sat together, their faces pale and drawn. "What do we do now?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Sarah shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know. We have to hold on. Someone will come. They have to." But as the night wore on, hope began to wane. The whispers grew louder, more intrusive, and the sense of dread became almost unbearable. It felt as if the forest itself was closing in, squeezing the life out of the stranded train and its desperate passengers. In the darkest hours before dawn, the passengers huddled together, their fear a palpable force. The Midnight Express had become a vessel of despair, trapped in an unending nightmare. As the first light of a new day began to filter through the trees, the realization set in that they were truly alone, abandoned in a hostile wilderness with no escape in sight. The first light of dawn brought little comfort to the passengers of the Midnight Express. Despite their efforts to signal for help with the horn and a fire, no response came. The oppressive silence of the forest thickened with each passing hour. Sarah, the last crew member, tried to keep everyone organized. She and Emily, along with Mr. Thompson, searched the train for overlooked supplies. In the third carriage, they found a small stash of canned goods and bottled water. It wasn't much, but it was a glimmer of hope. They distributed the supplies among the passengers and continued to sound the train horn at regular intervals. Night fell once more, and the whispers returned, growing louder as the darkness deepened. Emily clutched her shawl, her fear mounting. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the rear of the train. Sarah grabbed a flashlight, motioning for Mr. Thompson and Emily to follow. They found the rear door ajar, and footprints leading into the forest. "Those weren't there before," Emily whispered, trembling. They hurried back to the main carriage, locking the door behind them. Sarah addressed the frightened passengers. "There are footprints leading away from the train. Someone or something was here." Panic spread quickly. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Emily covered her ears, but the sound seemed to seep into her mind. Suddenly, the train shuddered violently, the lights flickering. A shadowy figure appeared at the rear door. Then the lights went out completely. When they came back on, 3 passengers were gone. The remaining passengers were in shock, their fear palpable. The Midnight Express had become a haunted vessel, with passengers vanishing one by one. Emily knew they were running out of time. The forest was closing in, and whatever malevolent force was at work was not finished with them yet. With the disappearance of 3 passengers, the already palpable fear among the survivors reached a fever pitch. Emily, Sarah, and Mr. Thompson huddled together with the remaining passengers, their minds racing with questions and terror. The whispers that had haunted them grew louder, seeming to mock their helplessness. Sarah took charge once more, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We need to stay together and stay alert," she said, her words a lifeline in the darkness. "We can't let fear divide us." But the remaining passengers were shaken, their trust in each other eroded by the inexplicable events unfolding around them. Emily could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. They were trapped in a nightmare with no escape in sight. As night fell, they gathered what little remained of their supplies and retreated to the main carriage. The doors were barricaded and the windows covered, but the sense of vulnerability remained. Emily sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the darkness outside, searching for any sign of what lurked beyond. The hours passed in a blur of anxiety and dread. The whispers seemed to echo through the train, their words unintelligible but filled with malice. Emily could feel them crawling under her skin, their presence a constant reminder of the danger they faced. Suddenly, a loud banging echoed through the carriage, causing everyone to jump. Sarah grabbed a flashlight, her hands shaking, and made her way to the door. She peered through the window, her breath catching in her throat. Outside, in the dim light cast by the moon, stood a figure. It was human-shaped, but its features were obscured by shadow. It reached out a hand, fingers curling around the door handle. Sarah stumbled back, her heart pounding. "We're not alone," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own fear. The passengers gathered around, their eyes wide with terror. Emily felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead as she watched the figure outside, its presence a chilling reminder of their vulnerability. With a suddenness that took them all by surprise, the figure vanished into the darkness. Sarah slammed the door shut, her hands trembling. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice urgent. "We can't stay on this train any longer." But the forest outside seemed to stretch on endlessly, its depths filled with unseen dangers. Emily knew that venturing out into the unknown was fraught with peril, but they had no other choice. They couldn't stay on the Midnight Express, trapped in a nightmare with no end in sight. With a sense of grim determination, they began to prepare to leave the train. They gathered what supplies they could carry and checked their makeshift weapons one last time. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices urging them to stay, but they ignored them, their minds set on escape. As they opened the door and stepped out onto the platform, the forest loomed around them, dark and foreboding. Emily took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. They were stepping into the unknown, but they were not alone. Together they would face whatever horrors awaited them in the darkness beyond the Midnight Express. Stepping off the Midnight Express felt like stepping into a nightmare. The forest loomed around them, its tangled branches casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. Emily shivered, her senses on high alert, as she followed Sarah, Mr. Thompson, and the other passengers onto the forest floor. The air was thick with a palpable sense of dread, and the whispers that had plagued them on the train seemed to follow them into the darkness. Emily clutched her makeshift weapon, a sturdy branch, tighter, trying to block out the unsettling voices that seemed to emanate from the very trees themselves. Sarah took the lead, her flashlight cutting through the inky blackness. They moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. Every rustle of underbrush, every creak of branches set their nerves on edge, and they moved in tense silence, straining to listen for any sign of danger. But the forest remained eerily still, as if holding its breath, waiting. The moon cast long, eerie shadows that seemed to dance and twist with each step they took. Emily's heart hammered in her chest, and she fought to keep her fear in check, reminding herself that they were not alone. Hours passed, and still they pressed on, their progress slow and painstaking. The darkness seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees closing in around them like silent sentinels. Emily could feel the weight of their isolation bearing down on her, a suffocating presence that threatened to overwhelm her. Suddenly, Sarah halted, her flashlight beam illuminating something ahead. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she saw it. A clearing in the forest, bathed in an otherworldly glow. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once, like something out of a nightmare. As they cautiously approached, Emily could see that the clearing was not empty. Strange, twisted shapes moved in the shadows, their forms indistinct and unsettling. The whispers grew louder, swirling around them like a malevolent fog. Sarah raised her hand, signaling for the others to stop. "We need to be careful," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the din of the whispers. "There's something here." They edged closer, their senses on high alert. As they entered the clearing, Emily felt a chill run down her spine. The air seemed to hum with a strange energy, and she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Then, suddenly, the shadows shifted, and a figure emerged from the darkness. A tall, gaunt figure with eyes that gleamed with a malevolent light. Emily's blood ran cold as she realized what they were facing. A creature of the forest, ancient and powerful, and utterly terrifying. Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice echoing through the clearing. The creature regarded them with an unreadable expression, its gaze piercing. "We are the guardians of this forest," it said, its voice like the rustle of leaves in the wind. "You have trespassed into our domain." Emily's heart raced as she realized the gravity of their situation. They were at the mercy of forces they couldn't begin to comprehend, trapped in a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. As the whispers grew louder, enveloping them in a suffocating embrace, Emily knew that their journey was far from over. They had entered the heart of the haunted forest, and the true horrors were yet to come. The guardian of the forest regarded them with an intensity that sent shivers down Emily's spine. Its eyes seemed to bore into her very soul, probing her fears and doubts with an unnerving clarity. Sarah, Mr. Thompson, and the other passengers stood frozen, their faces etched with a mixture of awe and terror. "We mean no harm," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "We're just trying to find our way out of the forest." The guardian's expression softened slightly, though its eyes remained watchful. "The forest does not take kindly to trespassers," it said, its voice a low rumble that seemed to reverberate through the clearing. "But perhaps you have come seeking something." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. "We're just trying to find our way home," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't mean to intrude." The guardian regarded them for a long moment, as if weighing their words. "You carry a heavy burden," it said finally, its voice grave. "The forest senses your fear and your sorrow. But know this, there are greater dangers lurking in these woods than you can imagine." Sarah stepped forward, her resolve unwavering. "We understand," she said, her voice firm, "but we can't stay here. We have to find a way out." The guardian nodded, as if acknowledging her words. "Very well," it said. "I will offer you guidance. But heed my warning. Beyond this point lies darkness. You must stay together and trust in each other if you are to survive." With that, the guardian turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving the travelers alone in the clearing. Emily's heart raced as she watched it go, a sense of unease settling in the pit of her stomach. They were venturing into the unknown, guided only by the cryptic words of a creature they barely understood. Sarah turned to the others, her voice steady despite the uncertainty in her eyes. "We have to keep moving," she said. "The guardian has offered us guidance, but we can't afford to let our guard down. Stay close and stay alert." With a renewed sense of purpose, they pressed on, following the path deeper into the forest. The whispers seemed to grow louder, swirling around them like a malevolent fog, but they pushed through, their determination unyielding. Hours passed, and still, they journeyed deeper into the heart of the haunted forest. The trees closed in around them, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Emily could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on her, a suffocating presence that threatened to overwhelm her. But they pressed on, guided by the faint glimmer of hope that flickered in the darkness. They were travelers in a land of nightmares, but they refused to let fear dictate their fate. With each step, they moved closer to the answers they sought, and the true horrors that awaited them in the depths of the haunted forest. The path through the haunted forest twisted and turned, leading the travelers deeper into its shadowed depths. Sarah, Emily, Mr. Thompson, and the remaining passengers moved cautiously, their senses on high alert as they navigated the eerie landscape. As they journeyed further, the forest seemed to come alive around them, its ancient trees whispering secrets and casting shifting shadows that danced in the moonlight. The air grew thick with a sense of foreboding, and Emily could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on her with each step. Suddenly, the path ahead split into two diverging trails, each disappearing into the darkness beyond. Sarah frowned, her brow furrowed in concern. "Which way do we go?" she muttered, her voice barely audible over the rustling of leaves. Mr. Thompson stepped forward, squinting into the darkness. "We should split up," he suggested, though he sounded unsure. "Cover more ground that way." But Sarah shook her head, her expression grim. "No," she said firmly. "We stick together. The forest is filled with dangers we can't begin to comprehend. We're safer as a group." Reluctantly, Mr. Thompson nodded in agreement, and they continued on the path to the left, their footsteps echoing through the silent woods. The whispers grew louder, swirling around them like a malevolent fog, but they pushed through, their resolve unyielding. As they journeyed deeper into the forest, the path became increasingly treacherous, winding through gnarled roots and tangled underbrush. Sarah stumbled, her foot catching on a hidden root, and Emily reached out to steady her. "We have to keep moving," Sarah said, her voice strained. "We can't afford to stop." But their progress was slow, hindered by the ever-present dangers of the forest. Shadows seemed to shift and move in the darkness, and Emily could feel eyes watching them from the shadows. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the trees, causing the travelers to freeze in their tracks. Emily's heart raced as she scanned the darkness, searching for the source of the sound. Then, with a suddenness that took her breath away, a pair of glowing eyes appeared in the shadows, a creature of the forest, its form indistinct and terrifying. Sarah raised her makeshift weapon, her hands trembling. "Stay back," she warned, her voice barely above a whisper. But the creature showed no signs of aggression, its eyes fixed on them with a strange intensity. Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that they were not alone in the haunted forest, that there were creatures lurking in the shadows watching their every move. With a sense of growing unease, they pressed on, their footsteps echoing through the silent woods. The path ahead was shrouded in darkness, and the true trials of the forest had only just begun. As the travelers ventured deeper into the haunted forest, the path grew increasingly treacherous, winding through dense thickets and tangled undergrowth. Sarah, Emily, Mr. Thompson, and the remaining passengers pressed on, their nerves on edge as they navigated the eerie landscape. The whispers that had plagued them on the train seemed to grow louder, swirling around them like a sinister melody. Emily could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on her, a suffocating presence that threatened to overwhelm her with each step. Suddenly, they stumbled upon a clearing, bathed in moonlight. In the center of the clearing stood a circle of ancient stones, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of weathering. Sarah approached cautiously, her gaze sweeping over the stones with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "These are ancient," Mr. Thompson remarked, his voice hushed. "They must hold some significance." Sarah nodded, her brow furrowed in thought. "They could be a marker of some kind," she mused. "Perhaps they'll lead us out of the forest." But as they approached the stones, a sense of unease settled over them like a shroud. The air grew thick with a strange energy, and Emily could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the clearing, a haunting, otherworldly sound that sent shivers down Emily's spine. She turned to see a figure emerge from the shadows, a woman cloaked in darkness, her eyes gleaming with an eerie light. "Who dares disturb the sacred stones?" the woman demanded, her voice a low, menacing growl. Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We mean no harm," she said, her words a plea for understanding. "We're just trying to find our way out of the forest." The woman regarded them with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "You carry the mark of the lost ones," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "You have strayed from your path and now you seek a way home." Emily's heart sank at the woman's words. They were lost, truly lost, in a forest that seemed intent on keeping them prisoner. But they couldn't give up hope, not yet. They had to find a way out, no matter the cost. The woman studied them for a long moment, as if searching for some hidden truth. Then, with a sigh, she raised her hand, gesturing toward the stones. "The path you seek lies beyond these stones," she said, her voice solemn. "But be warned, only the true of heart may pass. The forest will test you, and only those who prove themselves worthy will find their way home." With that, the woman vanished into the shadows, leaving the travelers alone in the clearing. Emily's heart raced as she looked to Sarah, her eyes filled with determination. "We can do this," Sarah said, her voice filled with resolve. "We just have to believe in ourselves and trust in each other. Together, we can overcome whatever challenges the forest throws at us." With a sense of renewed purpose, they approached the stones, ready to face whatever trials lay ahead. The forest was vast and unforgiving, but they were not alone. They had each other, and with that, they would face whatever horrors awaited them in the darkness beyond. The travelers stood before the ancient stones, their resolve steeled for the challenges that lay ahead. Sarah, Emily, Mr. Thompson, and the remaining passengers exchanged determined glances, silently reaffirming their commitment to each other. As they stepped forward, the stones began to shimmer with an ethereal light, casting an otherworldly glow over the clearing. The air hummed with a strange energy, and Emily could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on her like a heavy cloak. Suddenly, the stones shifted, rearranging themselves into a series of intricate patterns that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Sarah hesitated, her brow furrowed in concentration as she studied the patterns, searching for some hidden meaning. "We have to follow the pattern," she said finally, her voice steady despite the uncertainty in her eyes. "It's our only way forward." With a sense of determination, they set off, following the twisting path laid out before them. The forest seemed to come alive around them, its ancient trees whispering secrets and casting shifting shadows that danced in the moonlight. As they journeyed deeper into the heart of the forest, the path grew increasingly treacherous, winding through gnarled roots and tangled underbrush. Sarah stumbled, her foot catching on a hidden root, but Emily reached out to steady her. "We have to keep moving," Sarah said, her voice strained. "We can't afford to stop." But their progress was slow, hindered by the ever-present dangers of the forest. Shadows seemed to shift and move in the darkness, and Emily could feel eyes watching them from the shadows. Suddenly, the path split into two diverging trails, each disappearing into the darkness beyond. Sarah frowned, her brow furrowed in concern. "Which way do we go?" she muttered, her voice barely audible over the rustling of leaves. Mr. Thompson stepped forward, squinting into the darkness. "We should split up," he suggested, though he sounded unsure. "Cover more ground that way." But Sarah shook her head, her expression grim. "No," she said firmly. "We stick together. The forest is filled with dangers we can't begin to comprehend. We're safer as a group." Reluctantly, Mr. Thompson nodded in agreement, and they continued on the path to the left, their footsteps echoing through the silent woods. The whispers grew louder, swirling around them like a malevolent fog, but they pushed through, their resolve unyielding. As they journeyed deeper into the forest, the true trials of the heart began. They faced challenges that tested their courage, their strength, and their faith in each other. But through it all, they remained united, bound together by a shared determination to survive. Hours passed, and still they pressed on, their spirits undimmed despite the darkness that surrounded them. They were travelers in a land of nightmares, but they refused to let fear dictate their fate. With each step, they moved closer to the answers they sought, and the true horrors that awaited them in the depths of the haunted forest. The forest grew denser as the travelers continued their journey, each step taking them deeper into its shadowed heart. Sarah, Emily, Mr. Thompson, and the remaining passengers moved with caution, their senses on high alert as they navigated the twisting paths and looming trees. As they ventured further, the air seemed to grow colder, and the whispers of the forest became more insistent, echoing through the trees like a chorus of lost souls. Emily shivered, a sense of unease settling in the pit of her stomach as they pressed on. Suddenly, they came upon a clearing bathed in an eerie light. In the center of the clearing stood a large mirror, its surface reflecting the moonlight with an otherworldly glow. Sarah approached cautiously, her eyes narrowing as she studied her reflection. "It's a mirror," she said, her voice hushed. "But there's something strange about it." Emily stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the mirror's surface. As she approached, her reflection began to change, morphing into a series of unsettling images, a distorted version of herself, surrounded by shadows and darkness. "It's showing us our fears," Mr. Thompson observed, his voice tense. Sarah nodded, her expression grim. "We have to face them," she said, her voice resolute. "If we're going to find our way out of this forest, we have to confront our deepest fears." With a sense of determination, they approached the mirror, each one stepping forward to face their reflection. Emily's heart raced as she watched her own image shift and change, revealing the fears that lurked within her own heart. But as she looked deeper, she saw something else, a glimmer of hope, a spark of courage that burned bright despite the darkness that surrounded her. With a sense of newfound resolve, she met her own gaze in the mirror, her eyes filled with determination. "We can do this," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "We just have to believe in ourselves and face our fears head-on." Sarah and Mr. Thompson nodded in agreement, their expressions mirrored with determination. Together, they stood before the mirror, each one confronting their deepest fears and emerging stronger for it. As they turned away from the mirror, a sense of clarity washed over them, a newfound sense of purpose that fueled their resolve. The forest may be filled with terrors, but they would not let fear dictate their fate. With each step, they moved closer to the answers they sought, and the true horrors that awaited them in the depths of the haunted forest. The travelers pressed on through the haunted forest, their hearts heavy with the weight of their journey. Sarah, Emily, Mr. Thompson, and the remaining passengers moved with determination, their footsteps echoing through the silent woods. As they journeyed deeper into the heart of the forest, the air grew thick with a sense of foreboding, and the whispers that had haunted them since their arrival grew louder and more insistent. Emily could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on her, a suffocating presence that threatened to overwhelm her with each step. Suddenly, they stumbled upon a clearing bathed in moonlight. In the center of the clearing stood a towering tree, its gnarled branches reaching up toward the sky like grasping fingers. Sarah approached cautiously, her eyes narrowing as she studied the ancient tree. "It's the heart of the forest," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is where we'll find the answers we seek." Emily's heart pounded in her chest as they approached the tree, a sense of anticipation building within her. They had come so far, faced so many trials, and now, finally, they were on the verge of discovering the truth. As they reached the base of the tree, a figure emerged from the shadows, a creature of the forest, ancient and powerful, its eyes gleaming with an otherworldly light. "You have come far, travelers," the creature said, its voice like the rustle of leaves in the wind. "But your journey is not yet over." Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady, despite the fear in her eyes. "We seek a way out of this forest," she said, her words a plea for understanding. "We seek answers." The creature regarded them for a long moment as if weighing their words. Then, with a solemn nod, it raised its hand, gesturing toward the tree. "The answers you seek lie within," it said. "But be warned, what you find may not be what you expect." With that, the creature vanished into the shadows, leaving the travelers alone in the clearing. Emily's heart raced as she looked to Sarah, her eyes filled with determination. "We have to do this," Sarah said, her voice filled with resolve. "We've come too far to turn back now." With a sense of trepidation, they approached the tree, its ancient roots sinking deep into the earth. Sarah reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the rough bark, and as she did, the tree began to shimmer with an ethereal light. The air hummed with a strange energy, and Emily could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. With a sense of anticipation, they stepped closer, drawn inexorably toward the heart of the forest. As they reached out to touch the tree, a blinding light enveloped them, and for a moment, everything went white. When the light faded, they found themselves standing in a clearing bathed in sunlight, the haunted forest nowhere to be seen. They had found their way out, but the journey had changed them in ways they could never have imagined. As they looked out at the world beyond the forest, they knew that they would carry the memories of their ordeal with them always, a reminder of the strength and courage that had seen them through the darkest of times.